So, what if you could get a user manual for a political leader's mind, like a real guide to their psychological operating system? Well, believe it or not, the source material for today's explainer claims to be exactly that. And it proposes this really fascinating idea that if you understand the system, you can predict the outputs.
And this is a central idea we're going to dig into today. The source argues that a leader's behavior isn't just random chaos, but actually a very predictable system. The thinking goes, if you can just understand that core programming, you can anticipate the actions, the tweets, pretty much all the decisions.
Think of it like this. We're not just looking at a person. According to this analysis, we're examining a piece of software, an operating system that was installed decades ago and this is the key part, has apparently never been updated.
What are the core functions? The key commands? What's the source code look like? All right, let's crack it open and see what's inside. Okay, so first things first, we need to understand the basic architecture of the system. According to the source, the entire thing runs on a single primary fuel source.
And this is that fuel. We're talking about attention, praise, submission, even fear. The analysis claims that the quality of the attention doesn't really matter, only the intensity. So being feared is just as good as being loved, because, both confirm that you're important. Without this constant input, the system doesn't just malfunction. It risks what the source calls a structural collapse.
And this quote just brilliantly illustrates the system's core belief, right? The source points to this not as some kind of political promise, but as the perfect expression of the grandiosity that's hardwired into the program. Notice it's not we, not our team, but I, alone.
Okay, so that's the underlying code. But what does it actually do? How does it show up in the real world? Well, the manual points to a few key outputs that are pretty consistent.
Get this. The Washington Post's fact-checker cataloged over 30,000 false or misleading claims during his presidency. Now, the source presents this not as just simple lying, but as a predictable output of a system where reality is basically infinitely flexible.
And this number, wow. This represents the combined total from just two cases, the New York civil fraud and the E. Jean Carroll defamation cases. The source points to these massive judgments as the real-world consequences, the tangible cost of the system's actions.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, the concept of a revenge architecture. The analysis argues it's not just about getting even, it's a systematic algorithm. Every single perceived insult gets logged, stored indefinitely, and then retribution is executed whenever an opportunity comes up. It could be days, weeks, or even decades later.
So, if that's the program, where in the world did the code come from? To figure that out, the source material performs what it calls a psychological archaeology, to trace the system's origins way back to the beginning.
The analysis says the sequence here is absolutely crucial. It presents this series of formative wounds, where each one builds on the last, creating these layers of psychological defense that would eventually just harden into the permanent operating system.
This was the core instruction from his father, and the source interprets this not as some metaphor for being competitive, but as a literal, operational command. Destroy your competition, show absolutely no mercy, because winning is the only thing that exists, period.
The analysis points to this as the first foundational wound. At just 2.5 years old, his mother was hospitalized for nearly a year. The source argues that this kind of absence at such a critical moment for attachment basically corrupted the operating system right at the moment of installation.
So the analysis applies this clinical framework and estimates an ACE score of at least 6. It argues that this level of chronic childhood stress floods a developing brain with cortisol, physically shaping it to perceive threat literally everywhere.
So the base code was written in childhood. Then, in early adulthood, the source says it received 2 critical software upgrades that basically weaponized the existing programming.
This was the playbook he learned from his mentor, the infamous lawyer Roy Cohn. And the crucial point here is that these weren't just tips. The source frames them as a new set of commands, a new code that taught him to attack, to deflect, and to control the narrative at all costs.
And this slide just powerfully contrasts the public myth with the documented reality that's presented in the source. From the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into his finances to the ghostwriter of his own famous book, the analysis argues that the brand itself was the system's first major creation.
Ah, yes, a phrase coined by his ghostwriter for the art of the deal. The source says this became the system's public rationale for its most consistent output, a constant stream of exaggerations and falsehoods, which were just rebranded as a clever business strategy.
And this brings us to the final and maybe the most critical conclusion of this whole user manual.
The program is static. It does not learn, it does not update, and it does not change.
He's actually said this multiple times, and while he might see it as a boast about his consistency, the source presents this as a pretty startling confession that his emotional development just stopped. The defenses that a 6-year-old built to survive are apparently still running the show.
And this really is the key takeaway. The system is designed to reject any information that contradicts its own grandiose self-image. Criticism is just dismissed as an attack. Negative feedback is fake news. So according to this analysis, this makes learning from mistakes, which is the very engine of personal growth, structurally impossible.
And that right there is the final provocative question the user manual leaves us with. If the core programming really is this established, this rigid, and this predictable, well, what does that tell us about the future? According to this analysis, the outputs are knowable because the system never changes. And that is a sobering thought.